Low budget, high expectations, flywheelers, phone dagger. Okay, so the subject of our long, rambling lecture is flywheelers. When it comes to flywheelers, in terms of the practicality side of things, this is really down to personal preference. Essentially, most flywheelers have a rev trigger and a normal trigger, and then you've got to make the decision whether you want semi-auto, full auto, you want one of these select fire blasters which are becoming really popular now, which I haven't built one yet, but I plan to because they look fantastic. And that really comes down to how you play your game. The only thing to bear in mind is that if you take, for example, a Strife, and you start talking about making it full auto or select fire, those kits are not cheap, and we are talking about modding on a budget. So for the sake of this video, we are going to assume that you are sticking to whatever system of firing darts your blaster comes with, which, unless you've got a regulator, is either going to be full auto or semi-auto. Now, I do want to make a point here which really applies to springers as well, which is being careful not to get obsessed with FPS to the point that you mod yourself out of your games. It's very important when you're doing your research that you design your blaster in such a way that if the games you're playing have a 130 FPS cap, that your blaster isn't going to average above that, because then you're not going to be able to use it. And this is a really important point to make. Now, one of the advantages to creating, say, a flywheel blaster that is designed to use a 3S LiPo is that you can immediately reduce your FPS by sticking a 2S LiPo in it. When we're talking about modding on a budget then, the absolute easiest, cheapest and best way to immediately improve the performance of your blaster is a rewire. Now, don't be shy about having the stock motors in the blaster. Yes, if you're running your stock motors on a 3S or perhaps even a 2S LiPo, at some point they're going to burn out. But for the most part, I would say with most of the motors that seem to be in Nerf blasters at the moment, certainly I've found that you can get quite a lot of mileage out of them before they burn out. In fact, Hujin, my Raven with the 2-stage flywheel cages, the first stage is stock motors, and that has run through quite a few wars now, and they are absolutely fine. They are standing up to the 3S LiPo perfectly well at the moment, and I've got no complaints.
But Foamy, isn't rewiring flywheel blasters terribly complicated and difficult?
Well, actually no. If you've done even sort of basic kind of electronics when you were at school, or you've got the time to sit and watch a YouTube video, it's really not that difficult. When it comes to the actual rewire itself, it couldn't be simpler. You're going to want a few things to do the rewire. The first thing you're going to want is wire. And the wire that I tend to use is a 16 or 18 gauge. Now, I tend to go for the stuff that is silicon coated because then the soldering iron doesn't melt the insulation. It looks a bit tidier because, quite honestly, I'm not particularly good at soldering, and it makes my work look better than it probably is. Soldering iron. Now, when you're investing in your soldering iron, don't go for one of those cheap 20-30 watt ones. Quite honestly, they take so long to get a decent joint that you're probably going to melt components more frequently than you're going to actually manage to make a connection. Invest in a decent, at least 60 watt soldering iron, and it will make your life so much easier. Trust me on this, I've made that mistake. Don't make it for yourselves. And the only other thing you're going to need is a switch. Essentially what you want is a momentary switch. I'll put a link in the description to the ones that I normally use. But essentially they will look something like this, with a little flappy piece of metal coming off of there. The actual button is just there, and what happens is this piece of metal gets pushed down and it presses this button, and you can sort of cut this bit of metal off to length wherever you want it for what you're doing, or you can in fact cut them off completely and just have your trigger press straight onto that. And these have 3 tabs on them, and where they are varies depending on the product, but essentially what you've got is you've got common, normally closed, and normally open. Now, for those of you that don't know, essentially if you've got, let's have a basic circuit here with a battery in it and like a little kind of light bulb thing there. That circuit is open, which means that this light bulb will not light up. Now, if we press this switch so it's across, that circuit is closed, and a closed circuit will transmit power to your light bulb. So, normally open means that the switch is open and it will not power your flywheels or whatever else you've got it wired up to until this button is pressed. Normally closed, on the other hand, means that the circuit is already closed, and when you press this button, it opens the circuit. Now, you can do something called motor braking, which I'm not going to go into because it's not really the subject of this video, in which you do use that pin. However, for our purposes, we are going to ignore the normally closed pin. Now, you will also have in your flywheel cage your 2 motors. One of your motors will be that way round, and one of your motors will be that way round. And once you've wired it up, the first thing you want to do is pop a dart into the flywheel cage, press your button and make sure that your motors are going the right way round. And of course, you will have your battery. All you are going to do is you are going to wire this to this and this to this. You are then going to run this to your battery, this to normally open, and your battery to the common pin. It is that simple to wire up a basic flywheel blaster. High budgets, low expectations. Okay, so when it comes to performance, there is a little bit of an issue here. Again, the same as some springers with barrel drag. So let's say you've got a strife. Now, essentially, if you've got a strife, you've got your 2 motors with your flywheels there, and you've got a little barrel. Okay, so your dart is only going to bounce around that far before it leaves the barrel. Now, let's say you've got a modular CCS-10 or a Rapid Strike, or the Raven is really bad for it. So your barrel is in fact this long, and that means even more dart bouncing around, even more barrel drag, which is going to even further negatively affect your performance. Similarly, if you've got a strife and then you put a barrel extension as part of a body kit on it, that is going to reduce your performance as well. Now, the way around this is a 2-stage system. You would basically have a set of flywheels, which would then go into a second set of flywheels, which were closer to the barrel. And this will actually give you greater performance than just using a strife. The next thing to do once you've had your rewire is to save up your money and get yourself some new motors. The motors are the next most important thing in terms of upping the performance of your flywheel blaster. And with motors, you're looking at two things. You're looking at the RPM and you're looking at the torque. Essentially, the RPM is how fast your flywheels are going to go round and therefore how fast your dart is going to be flung out. The torque, on the other hand, is essentially how quickly those flywheels reach their maximum speed. So if you've got low torque on your motors, you could be holding down that rev trigger for sort of 3 or 4 seconds before you're actually in a position to start firing darts off without your blaster, either not firing them very far or, in the worst case scenario, jamming. Higher torque motors, on the other hand, will allow you to start firing darts much quicker after you've pulled that rev trigger. To tell it to start, to tell them loads and loads and loads, loads and loads and loads. There are loads of reviews and guides out there about motors, and essentially pick the motor that's going to work best for you, do your research, and as I've already said, don't be afraid to save up for a more expensive motor and just rely on the stock ones for the moment. So when it comes to what really, in my mind, is the final element in terms of improving the performance of a flywheel blaster, you're looking at the wheels and the flywheel cage. You're really going to have to do your research and work out what is within your budget, what you are prepared to save up for, and how much you want to spend for what performance increase you're ultimately going to get out of it. Really, if you possibly can, you only want to remove your flywheels twice during the course of an extended modding period. The first time when you put the new motors in, and the second time when you've got your upgraded flywheels and your upgraded flywheel cage. Otherwise you're going to be forever taking them off and putting them on. Every time you take them off there is a risk that you're going to damage something because they are a pain to remove. So when we're looking at that sort of mantra of making sure that your blaster is still usable for wars in between each stage of modification, we're really sort of looking at doing things in quite a particular order in my mind, and the first stage of that is the rewire, which is also going to involve investing in some kind of battery. So you're going to want to know already what motors you're aiming to use, and my recommendation would be to invest in a LiPo and a decent charger. And again, do your research. All LiPos are not created equal and some are safer than others. Beyond that, you're looking at upgrading your motors. You're also looking at investing in a cage and wheels. And that really, as your basic modification, is it. Beyond that, you may want to look at things like battery doors so that you can actually house your LiPo sensibly. But as I've said before, it's not necessary. If you've got some electrical tape, you've got some gaffer tape, you've got maybe a length of Velcro that you can wrap around your battery, it will hold it in and it will make it usable. And those parts are things that you can think about later if you need to. So for my money, that really is the best way to modify your flywheel blaster if you're on a budget. As with everything, do your research, decide what your mod is going to be before you start it, work out the process you're going to go through, and then commit to finishing it before you start thinking about spending money on anything else, and you will end up with an absolutely fantastic war-effective blaster that you are still able to use at every stage of the modification. If there are any questions, or if there's anything I haven't covered yet in this series that anyone would like to see me cover, by all means pop it in the description and I will do my best to cover it in the next video. Thank you.